All right, guys. Our next guest is a former UFC fighter who's one of the best analysts in the MMA game today, a Marine and war hero, a former WEC light heavyweight champion, and a CEO of Higher Heroes. It's a pleasure to welcome Brian Stann for the first time to Submission Radio. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much for reaching out and getting me on.
No, it's a huge pleasure, especially because it's your first time, and congratulations. A couple of weeks ago marked 3 years officially since you first commentated in the UFC. Looking back to 2012, which feels like an eternity ago, did you expect to have such a successful career as an analyst and commentator and have people wanting you to potentially see you replace Joe Rogan in the future?
I can't say I expected that. I certainly hoped. I hoped that it would work well. I was retired, I hadn't announced my retirement yet, but I went and I auditioned to call football, which was something I had never done before. But I went for it, and a bunch of other, really talented American football players, went for it as well. I happened to get it. And a couple months after receiving the position, that's when the UFC called and asked me to call that first pay-per-view. They said, look, we've got a hunch you can do it, and we want to give you a shot. And a few days after the event, they called me and said, hey, look, as soon as football season's over, we want to get you in the rotation. So I was fired up because, look, I love calling college football. I've called boxing events, love doing it. But I'll be honest with you. If I have my choice, I would be cage side calling those fights each and every time. I mean, it doesn't feel like work to me. I love it. I love this sport. And more than anything, I love the athletes in the sport. I love watching them go on this journey, talking to them and trying to do my best to tell their story and tell the story of the fight that they're in right now. And it's just a blast for me. I'm really honored to do it, and I will ride this wave as long as I can.
Well, I'm just wondering because fans were a little bummed out. Were you bummed out when you found out that you wouldn't be flying to Australia to call UFC Brisbane? Because to our knowledge, we don't remember you ever coming down to Australia.
I've never been to Australia. I've wanted to go. I mean, come on, let's be honest here. There's people who say, oh, I've always wanted to go here or there, and they're lying through their teeth, right? But everybody wants to go to Australia. Let's face it. And so I've wanted to go every year. The problem is that Kenny Florian lives in Los Angeles, and so typically it's a little bit easier of a flight to send him, vice me, out of Atlanta. And so I keep missing these opportunities. The next card that comes up, seriously, I'm going to call him and say, look, man, is there any way, how can I sweeten the pot here and get a trade?
You need to do some behind-the-scenes sabotage work and make sure Kenny Florian is somehow sick on that day so you get the gig and fly down to Australia. But in all seriousness, we don't have too long with you, so we're very excited to pick your mind as an analyst about some MMA's biggest topics. This week saw some big news in Cris Cyborg's first fight in the UFC being announced against Leslie Smith at UFC 198. It's an exciting time for fans. Tell us, what do you think of this matchup and Leslie for stepping up and taking it?
I like it. And I got a lot of criticism on the internet because I pushed out a tweet saying that, I like the fact that Leslie Smith jumps at these opportunities. You can't, a lot of fighters say, I want to be paid more. I want bigger matchups. I want to be on the main card. But then they don't take chances like this. And I've met Leslie before. I've called one of her fights before. And she's a pleasure to be around. A very positive-minded woman who believes in herself and knows that, look, it's not over until the fight actually happens. And so I like the fact that she jumped at it. Nobody else wanted it. And I'm happy that Cyborg, one of the, if not, one of the best female fighters in the world, finally gets a shot on the biggest stage. I am very close friends with her nutritionist who gets her on weight. And I'm confident that she can get down to 135 eventually and will do that. And I want to see how she does against the best in the world, because that's not who she's been fighting. Although Invicta is a fantastic promotion, I want to see how she does. So I'm excited. I plan to be down in Brazil for UFC 198. So I should have pretty good seats to watch that bout, and I'll be watching closely.
Oh, yeah, and that's an amazing card from what we've seen so far. It's shaping up to be a huge event. I'm just curious, you have confidence in Cyborg getting down to 135. I'm just wondering where that stems from, because she, for years, said she can, then she can't, and then recently she sort of said, look, I'm done. I'm not going to get down to 135. Why are you so confident that she'll do it now?
Well, my buddy George Lockhart has literally had to live with her to get her on to weight before. He'll rent an apartment down the street. I mean, he manages her day to day, and he's told me, look, she can get on weight. The frustration from her end, I think, is finding the big fights and finally getting one, where I think there was, hey, it doesn't make sense to bring her over unless it's going to be against Ronda. I think there was a lot of different factors in the game. I think her frustration was like, you know what? If I'm never going to get consistent fights at 135 and be brought over to the big show, then it's not worth it for me to go through all this. And, you know, I think that's her frustration. I think she can make the weight, and I think it would be the best financial opportunity for her to do so. And if my buddy George says he can get her there healthy and allow her to perform the best, then I believe him. I mean, he's never I've never seen him proven wrong before. He's absolutely fantastic with these athletes.
So I'm just wondering, because people are sort of saying that this is like a Cyborg. She almost has her own division. She's a 140-pound fighter, or at least in the UFC, she's fighting catchweight. So do you think that this is sort of like her dipping her toe in, and eventually she will make it to bantamweight as opposed to just taking big fights at catchweight?
Yeah, it is. And you know what? People love to point out, well, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. Look, nothing's fair in business. Okay, we all have regular jobs, and we see things being done unfair all the time. You know, someone just got hired onto a company, they've been there for 6 months, and they get the big promotion that the person who was there for 4 years didn't get. These things happen. And the bottom line is people are intrigued by Cyborg. She's been crushing people for years, and people want to see her in the big show. And so finding a way to gradually get her comfortable and get her in, and get her on a big card in Brazil in front of her own people, it made sense. And nobody really wanted to fight. And if everybody turned it down, it wouldn't happen. But there was a girl out there named Leslie Smith who says, you know what? I want to be a big name fighter. I want to be someone that everybody knows. Here's my opportunity. And I think she's in a win-win situation. You know, I think if she can get this fight out of the first round, she's going to exceed people's expectations. But she's tough. You know, she's tough. She trains with some really talented people. Don't be surprised if she comes out there with a pretty good game plan and you know, can add some wrinkles that maybe people don't expect. You know, whereas, you know, we know what to expect from Cyborg. Cyborg's going to come out very aggressive, and she's an excellent athlete. She throws massive bombs, and she presents a huge challenge to any woman on the planet in mixed martial arts, regardless of weight. But we'll get to see her at 140 and get a view. How does she look at 135? Can she bring all that power? Can she be that aggressive at 135 pounds? You know, this will be a little bit of a tell if Leslie can challenge her, if Leslie can survive in there. And who knows, man? I'll tell you what, I've analyzed a lot of fights and a lot of skills and technique in the last year and a half. There's everything is pointing towards the direction that this fighter should win based on their skill sets, their technique, and their current life and training situation. This fighter should win, right? And then it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Nate Diaz shouldn't come in on a 5-day training camp after doing shots in Mexico, shots of alcohol, that is. He drinking on a boat on vacation, comes in with like a 5-day training camp and finishes Conor McGregor. That shouldn't necessarily happen, but it did. And that's why I tell anybody who thinks that they're so certain on any fighter in this sport that you got to be careful. I've been doing this for a couple years now, and I've been surprised many times. In fact, you know, me and John Anik have called 2 cards where I think every single underdog won. I know there was one in Natal, Brazil, where every underdog won. We did one other one where I think all but 2 favorites lost.
It's a crazy sport, Brian, and I think you're right about Leslie. I mean, she's coming off a huge win over Inakai, and like you mentioned, a charismatic person. We spent some time with her in Brisbane and very excited for this fight. But moving on, I mean, there's some other big news in the world of MMA this week. Jon Jones was pulled over by a police officer for allegedly drag racing. Now, Brian, some people see this video as an example of Jones being mistreated by the police, while others see it as an unnecessary controversy surrounding Jon Jones. I'm just curious, what do you make of it?
You know, I think both of those claims have some validity, right? Any wrongful treatment or profiling that Jon Jones is receiving, you know, he can't play the victim here. He's got to accept the fact that, you know what, I chose to do something that was going to be a public job. I want to be a star. I want to make the money of a star. Well, guess what? You know, stars endure more attention than other people do. Then he also made the choices that ended up in a hit and run accident. So if you think you're going to do something like that and not attract more police attention, you're wrong. It's going to happen. You know, but when I watched the video, you know, certainly Jon seems to be adamant from the beginning that he did nothing wrong. Typically, people who are guilty of something aren't that confident that they didn't do anything wrong. Right. And Jon was right away, which leads me to believe that there may be some validity that he's being, he's being targeted and profiled in that city. But he has to understand the fact that he's brought some of that on himself, and he could have handled that situation differently. He can be upset and not he cannot call names. There's no need for you to call an officer a name. There's no need for you to make some of those comments. I get that you're frustrated, but you are the champion of the world, and that is only going to bring more undue attention on you now. You insult a police officer, he's going to go back to the barracks, and more people are going to be looking for that white Corvette. And if you run a stop sign, you can expect somebody's going to see it. If you run a red light and it may have been yellow, you never know. You may hear about it and get issued a warning. But he's asking for more attention when he calls them names as well. And so it's a tough situation. I mean, we've all done that. We've all sped, we've all run. I mean, we all make those mistakes. But at the same time, when you choose to do something that pays you millions of dollars to be the champion of the world, you don't get as much flexibility as other people do. And he's brought some undue attention on himself through some of his actions. And so it's tough. It's not going to be easy. And I know that town. That's a small town. And if you become the villain there, it can be really difficult moving forward. So he's got some decisions to make and be smart so he can keep his focus on what he needs to do. And that's beating Daniel Cormier instead of having to focus on, dealing with Albuquerque PD.
It's interesting that you say that, Brian, because, I mean, you described the situation very well. I'm just curious, do you think that if Jon, for example, didn't call the police officer some of those names, then this situation would be almost completely different? Do you think that if he sort of refrained a little bit, that this situation could possibly even be clearer as the police, mistreating Jon and really Jon doing nothing wrong?
Well, I mean, I don't think it would have gotten him out of a ticket, right? The officer pulled him over for a reason and had every intention of giving him a ticket, right? But knowing that he was being filmed on a chest camera, he could have chose to say different things, and it would have been better for his brand as a fighter and for the narrative that he has really worked on improving his character and doing the right thing, right? But when you go on there and you get that frustrated, then you call names. I mean, I think there have been plenty of people that would have believed him that, hey, he was wrongfully profiled because he's Jon Jones. He's he has a loud engine, and he did something that may or may not have been a mistake. I think a lot of people would have sided him. But once you go and call someone disgusting and a pig and everything else, you're crossing the line when you're name calling. You can get your point across and say, I think this is wrong what you're doing, and I will go to court to prove my case. You were wrong from behind me. I was not drag racing. Could have done it better. But again, that's hard. I'm not him in the moment. I'm not, if I was wrongfully pulled over and getting issued an expensive ticket, I'm sure I'm going to be upset too. But I think for him, he's got to take a deep breath and start to think a little bit, because he's not going to get out of this, unless he just wants to retire right now and walk away from fighting. It's just going to happen. There's going to be a lot of attention brought on him wherever he goes, especially in a small town like Albuquerque.
Sure. And just last thing on Jones, you've known the man for a number of years. With more controversy going to UFC 197, does this do anything to hurt Jon Jones going to the fight with DC, or do you think it doesn't really even affect him?
I don't, Jon, I will tell you, distractions really don't matter to him. It doesn't matter. This sport, he's a guy who this sport has come to naturally more than any I've ever witnessed. So I don't think it does anything in terms of, the fight or any of that stuff. But I do believe it actually helps sell more tickets. I really do. I think that more people are going to tune in, and they're either going to take the side of, this guy's being wrongfully targeted. He's trying to clean up his life. He's trying to do the right thing. Or other people are going to say, I can't stand this guy. Who calls a law enforcement officer a pig and all these? You shouldn't be doing that. Just keep your mouth shut. There's going to be both sides. It's going to generate a lot. I mean, look how many people are talking about him now and talking about the Daniel Cormier fight. We were all already interested, but now you're getting a lot more people talking about the fight. So, at the end of the day, I think it's going to put more money in his pocket to sell more pay-per-views. Now that's not me saying he should go do more of it. That's the exact opposite what I'm saying. Call it a day. Hire a driver. Get a Honda. People don't pull over people driving. Well, no, never mind. You live in America, buy America. Go buy a little Ford car, Ford Fusion or something. People won't pull you over as much.
Buy Prius.
Yeah, that's it. It's time to call it Uber driver. Now, we mentioned UFC Brisbane before, Brian, but a couple of weeks ago, obviously, there was a number of massive upsets here in Australia. Fighters such as Dan Kelly and to some degree Jake Matthews got some big wins. But one of the fights that didn't really surprise people was Mark Hunt's knockout over Frank Mir. You mentioned how Frank had nothing left to prove, and you may possibly like to see him retire and come over to a commentating job. Now, for those people who didn't really catch your thoughts on Fox Sports when you spoke about it, can you sort of explain your reasoning behind it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm always overly cautious when it comes to this game and fighters fighting too long. And people don't like it sometimes. People say, "Who are you to tell anyone to retire?" Look, I'm not in an authoritative position to tell anybody to retire, but I am an analyst, and they ask my opinion there, and I'm thinking of Frank Mir, the father and the husband. I've seen Frank Mir with his family. He is a very good family man. I don't think he has anything left to do in this to prove in this sport. I mean, he's a two-time champion. And that's despite a very bad motorcycle accident that he overcame, came back. It was still an elite level heavyweight for a very long period of time. He's got massive wins. He's an excellent analyst on television as well. He's called fights before. I think he's got a bright future ahead of him in all that. It's just not worth taking any more damage to the head. Anybody who wants to kid themselves and act like a lifelong of getting hit in the head and in a list of concussions is a positive thing, they're wrong. Now, that being said, we all accept that risk in this sport. We do. But there is a time. There's a time when you have to say, look, the risks no longer outweigh the benefits. And for Frank Mir, I don't think it outweighs it. He's been TKO'd or KO'd 8 times in his life. He has a lot more to live for. He no longer needs fighting financially, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of things Frank Mir is capable of. And he's got a beautiful family that he has to lead and that he's got to provide for. And if you push it too long in combat sports or worse, I mean, you see what happens in American professional football, it can be very, very negative, and it can take away your ability to provide for your family and have a great quality of life. I want to see Frank Mir have good quality of life in his 50s, not in his 30s, and not just now when he's still fighting. And so, I'm looking at it as Frank Mir, the father, coming from Brian Stann, the father, and a guy who, one of my first interactions with Frank Mir was I fought in the WEC. I fought there one night, and I didn't have availability to any really good training when I was in the Marine Corps. Mm-hmm. And so the promoter there had asked Frank if after the fights he would meet me at the gym. So it's 1:30 in the morning in Las Vegas, and I fly out back to my base the next morning, and I'm in Cobra Kai gym doing jiu-jitsu with Frank Mir, and he's teaching me the proper escape to an armbar. Wow. That's the first interaction I have with Frank Mir. How many guys are going to be willing to do that? And I'll never forget that time. And he was a great guy, a very smart man, and I don't see the reason to do something that could jeopardize that going forward.
He's a man who's very generous with his time, and as far as commentary, I think Brian Stann and Frank Mir, people talk about dream fights, but that's like a dream commentary team that I think a lot of people will be interested. But moving on, let's talk about the current landscape of the UFC. Currently, it seems like UFC 200 will be headlined by McGregor versus Diaz number 2. Your thoughts, Brian? Do you think the rematch makes sense?
Financially, I do. I mean, you can't deny the revenue it generated. And look, let's be honest here. Everybody who puts the gloves on and walks in the octagon, and the people that put the money up to get the lights on and air this thing on television, they're all in it to make money, and that's always going to drive the decisions. I would love to see Frankie Edgar fight Conor. No doubt about it. I want to see how he would do up against that kind of challenge, a guy that can take him down, that can grapple, that has excellent cardio. How accurate will McGregor be against a guy who's a little bit faster than him? How will Frankie hold up against a guy who's unpredictable and has so much depth in his striking game as Conor? There's a lot of things I'd love to see about that fight, but that Conor Nate Diaz fight, the buildup in a short amount of time was excellent. It sold massively, and when you look at the numbers, if you're Conor McGregor and you're sitting back there saying, hey, who do you want to fight? His answer is going to be whoever helps me make the most money. If you ask Nate Diaz, who do you want to fight next? Whoever makes me the most money. And both of those guys made their best payday ever fighting each other. And so you can't blame them for wanting to run it back either. And I know a lot of hardcore fans definitely want to see Frankie get the shot. I'm one of those guys as well. But I totally understand the business reasoning behind doing the rematch. And honestly, if I'm coaching Conor right now, look, I mean, guys at that level can beat anybody on any given night, right? But if you're a manager of a fighter, you got to constantly keep their best interests in mind. If he loses to Nate Diaz again, he's back where he is right now. If he goes out there and fights Frankie Edgar, it's a very dangerous fight for him, and he loses to Frankie and loses his 145-pound title, that really hurts the Conor McGregor brand. That does further damage to it, and that's harder to recover from. That may leave it may take longer to get back to those big Conor McGregor paydays after that fight. I'm not sure what his contract is. So, from a business side, if I'm managing Conor McGregor, that's the way I'm looking at it. My job is to make him the most money over the longest period of time I can. It's get him this rematch in a fight that he clearly won round one, have him fight smarter, but get him in a fight where he has the least amount to lose when you're coming off a loss. If I'm managing Frankie Edgar and I want him to get that fight, Frankie's just not a boastful guy. He's probably one of the highest character guys in UFC rosters. A great husband, great father. He's incredible, an incredible fighter. But he's going to have to go out there and do something to make it personal. He's going to have to do something that he hasn't done before to sell a fight, to get his name out there. Not his style to do that. He likes to talk with his fists and his skills inside the octagon. But I'm pushing him to do everything in his power to campaign and get that fight, because that's the fight that Frankie wants, and it's the fight Frankie needs right now, so he can make the most money.
The burning question for fans is, why do it at welterweight when both fighters are more suited for a fight at lightweight? Now, there's a bunch of theories on this, but why do you think the UFC are looking to go with that weight class? And do you think it has anything to do with setting up a future fight against GSP? Because there's been a bit of that going around as well this week.
Yeah, maybe, who knows? That certainly could be a consideration. Honestly, as close as I am to this fight game, I have not heard anything definitive on GSP's return. So anything that I've heard is an opinion, and nobody knows for sure. I think, GSP, I know him personally. I haven't spoken to him in a long time, but, he could be a guy that's waffling a little bit on that decision and what he wants to do. I think doing the fight at 170, I have no idea. But in my perspective, if I put the Brian Stann promoter hat on, I do the fight at 170 because Conor's a guy that eventually, he sells a lot of tickets, right? So, but the other thing is he's a guy that could potentially fight at 155 pounds one day. We all know that's where his career may lead him. So if he happens to lose this fight again, it's better for him to lose at 170 because it just sounds better, right? It sounds better to have him lose at 170 at a welterweight division where he fought up 2 weight classes, vice just fighting up 1, because that kind of hurts his marketability at 155 pounds if he decides to enter that weight class one day.
For sure. Great.
That is pure speculation. That's inside the head of Brian Stann. I have heard nothing from the UFC on that, if that has any impact on their decision.
No, of course.
It could very well be the 2 fighters want to fight at 170.
Sure, and we definitely appreciate your analysis and your honesty, Brian. Let's jump over to your career. You've obviously had some great wins in the UFC, but fans saw you retire after you expressed concern with fighters using PEDs, and one of your key losses, and one where a win could have really potentially gotten you a title shot, was to Chael Sonnen, who famously failed multiple drug tests. Now that the sport has better testing, do you feel like there may be a chance you'd return for a fight or two? Because we're hearing rumors about potentially Brian Stann maybe having some more fights.
I'll tell you, not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about it. And certainly when we got this new drug testing into place, I considered it. But, stepping out of my own skin and looking at the situation and thinking about my family, what's best for them, and my current career projection in business and both on television, it's tough. It's tough to launch a comeback at my age and say, hey, honestly, if I'm going to come back, it's because I believe that I can compete for the middleweight title. And it's really hard to be honest with yourself. But when I stepped back, a year ago and looked at the middleweight division, I had to be really honest with myself. If I'm coming back, it's going to be for selfish reasons. It's not going to be what's best for my family in terms of any long-term damage I may endure. And do I really, just take, not being Brian Stann, just be an analyst, look at my tape, look at the tape of Luke Rockhold, look at my tape, look at the tape of Chris Weidman, Jacare, Yo Romero. I'd like to believe I could beat every one of those guys. But, Brian Stann, the husband and father, has to really take into account, are you willing to put your family through that? And at the same time, if you're going to go ahead and try and fight those type of guys again, you can't be taken off every weekend to do broadcasting. You can't have the time to run a company that has nearly 90 full-time employees. you got to focus just on fighting. So the opportunity cost of all the other ventures I have that I'm going to do a lot longer than my fight career are pretty heavy, and I could lose, and I could lose big. And so again, the risk outweighed the gains, and it's a tough decision. It's a tough thing to be honest with yourself as a fighter, because we all like to think that we can beat anybody on any given night. And I mean, every day I go to the gym, I still visualize myself making that comeback, but it's not going to happen, man. I'm almost 36 years old. I'm not as strong and as fast as I was 3 or 4 years ago, and that's just a fact. And so it would be, while I still think I can go out there and I can compete with the number 10 through 20 ranked guy in the middleweight division and do pretty darn well, it's not worth it, because then I could lose my position as one of the guys in rotation of broadcasting, and then I could forfeit my position. My board of directors may say, you know what, we can't have you running this company anymore. We've got to find somebody else because you're not focused enough. And those are opportunities I can't lose. Those are the opportunities that sustain and provide for my family.
I'm very impressed with your honesty, Brian. I'm just very curious. You mentioned that the part of the risk would have been for selfish reasons. What were those selfish reasons, if I may ask?
Well, it's glory, it's attention. That's the hardest thing for fighters to walk away from. We everybody loves attention. Everybody loves being made a big deal out of, and that's what's tough when you walk out of fighting. People no longer ask you about all the cool things you used to be a part of. And the other piece of that is, for a guy like me, it comes at a cost. It's not just the fights. It's every day in the gym. It's the cumulative headshots that I've taken since I was in third grade playing American football. I mean, I played Pop Warner football in America, where we hit each other hard every single day. And I did that for 6 years. Before then, I played 4 years of high school football. Then I played 4 years of college football. It's a lot of shots. Then I went in the military and had some things go on there. And then, I fought for nearly a decade. That's a long tenure of having a massive head like I do and getting hit in it. And you run some of those risks. And when you look at things like CTE and some of the things that are happening, I think our sport's really trying to get ahead of that, whereas the NFL is vastly behind it. You just heard two owners in the National Football League say ridiculous things about there not being a connection between, football and certain side effects of getting hit in the head. It was ridiculous, and it was ignorant for them to say that. I think that in our sport, we're being more honest, even though we're much, much younger. And it's not like my head trauma solely comes from mixed martial arts. I don't feel like I took a lot of damage in this sport. Where I took a lot more damage was in football. And having called college football, having been on the sidelines with an NFL team this season, I could tell you that sport is far, far, far more dangerous than mixed martial arts.
Yeah, certainly. And we appreciate the honesty, Brian. Literally, we could sit here all day. We have so much stuff to talk to you about, but our time is up. And you guys can check Brian out on Twitter @BrianStann. And for all your U.S. listeners, make sure to support Hire Heroes, which empowers U.S. military members, veterans, and spouses to succeed in the civilian workforce. You can find out more information at hireheroesusa.org. As always, Brian, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, my pleasure, guys. Thanks so much for having me, and great questions, man. I really appreciate it, and I'm definitely going to look in and start and listen to some of these episodes because you guys do a really good job. So thank you.